So I have tentatively named my project The Rhetoric of Identity Politics. Really, the project began because a professor in another class asked me to research the rise of white nationalism in the US and Europe. And while I can't disagree that there's been an increase in racist sentiment, or at least an increase in the acceptability of racism, I don't really agree with his suggestion that there's a massive racist phenomenon overtaking democratic politics. The phenomenon I have noticed, however, is increased polarization and anger within political discourse. Not only do I feel stuck in the center of this sort of political horseshoe, I've noticed that those who inhabit each of the far ends of the political spectrum are approaching political discourse with such fervent emotions that they're not willing to listen to one another. And as a result, we're no longer having national conversations about our problems and how to fix them. So in a nutshell, my research question when I began was, where is all this polarization coming from, and why are people so emotionally attached to their political opinions? I began my research with the assumption that identity politics is likely the culprit for why people have developed this bizarre emotional attachment to their political opinions, and thus why there's so much polarization. Identity politics, to define it, is what occurs when people rely on their personal identities like race, religion, socioeconomic status, and then they use it as the basis for their political leanings, rather than the traditional American pragmatic approach to political problem solving. And I found that there are several scholars much smarter than me who've made the same observations about identity politics. Professor Mark Lilla says that there's basically been a shift from the group identity of the civil rights era to individual identity. He says today that our identities function as this little homunculus that we cherish and value and hold dear to our hearts, and that politics is being exploited and used as an extension of our precious little identities rather than for its intended purpose, which is to gain power and create policy. So in my search to try and understand the dynamic of identity politics, I found two other scholars named Bendari and Hobson. They argue that there are three competing theories of identity politics at play in Western democracies. The first one is race-based identity politics, which is self-explanatory. The second is citizen versus non-citizen, which we see demonstrated in our fierce debate here in the US over immigration. And then the other is a cosmopolitan identity, which is like an enlightened, educated sort of elitism. And their theory, combined with Professor Lilla's, really laid the foundation for the dynamics of identity politics. As I continued my research, I found an article called Racial Fig Leaves. And this article is really what began guiding my research towards the rhetoric of identity politics. The author describes a rhetorical device that she calls fig leaves, which Trump and other politicians use to camouflage the racist meaning behind their messages. She says that fig leaves stimulate racism in people who harbor racial resentment, but don't consider themselves to be racist. So this discussion of resentment was a huge red flag for me, because resentment is clearly a function of identity politics. Because identity politics creates these distinctions between us and them, which leads people to resent members of the other group. But this article really expresses how language can be manipulated to stimulate any emotion, not just resentment, which can then be wielded to solidify groups and further entrench political division. So this article led me to my real question, which is, how do politicians use language as a means to create identity and exploit it to their benefit? Researching this question brought me to what is probably the most valuable article of all of my sources, which is called Capturing Desire by a man named James Martin. This article examines political discourse through both rhetorical analysis and psychoanalysis to explain how politicians mobilize people's desires. He uses work from renowned psychologists like Sigmund Freud, Melanie Klein, and Jacques Lacan to explain how intense emotions like fear, anxiety, and specifically alienation can be harnessed through political discourse to shape people's judgments. Martin argues that the politician's job is not to communicate facts, but to shape the public's reception of those facts. And that language is the underlying structure through which meaning is created in society. Martin's argument is incredibly in-depth, and it provides a comprehensive overview of how political language can tap into the psyche. So as for where I am today, I would like to take the work of Professor Lilla and the work of Bhandari and Hobson, their work on the dynamic of identity politics, and combine it with Martin's rhetorical and psychological analysis to really understand how language taps into these repressed emotions and encourages these political identities to form. It would also be really useful to look at some of the quantitative approaches and some of the other sources I didn't get to mention, and where they analyze speeches to create word correlations and then create meaning from those correlations. But really, I want to try and identify the language of identity politics. And as for the question of what was the most useful part of this entire process, the answer is going to be the annotated bibliographies. They feel like torture, and I think everybody hates writing them, but they're so incredibly useful, and it makes researching so much easier when you have the highlights of all your sources at your fingertips. But that's it. That's all I have.